Number 1 is Jodi Arias. June 4, 2008, Mesa, Arizona. The morning began like any other. Travis Alexander moved through his usual routines, preparing for the day, sending messages to friends, and completing small tasks with the calm focus that had always defined him. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary Thursday. Yet beneath the surface, the day carried subtle cracks in what appeared to be a normal life. Small incidents, a lingering text, an unanswered call, hinted at emotional currents that were already shifting toward something darker. What seemed trivial in the moment would later be seen as early signs of a tragedy few could have anticipated. Travis was known for his charm, discipline, and devotion to both faith and family. His friends described him as approachable, energetic, and full of ambition. On the surface, Jodi Arias appeared similarly ordinary, social, outgoing, and striving for connection. Their shared experiences, dates, work trips, casual laughter, projected an image of a young couple navigating life's typical challenges. Behind that facade, however, tensions were quietly mounting. Neither outsiders nor acquaintances could have predicted how quickly routine life would give way to obsession, conflict, and irreversible consequences. The contrast between public calm and private unrest was stark, though invisible at the time. Beneath ordinary interactions, a web of emotional strain was forming. Jodi's repeated messages and calls, often intense and insistent, collided with Travis' attempts to maintain distance. Friends noted her jealousy, emotional volatility, and subtle manipulations that intensified every encounter. Travis struggled with frustration and guilt, trying to preserve peace while confronting growing discomfort. Small arguments, secret meetings, and unspoken fears became routine, eroding trust and patience on both sides. These psychological undercurrents simmered quietly, unrecognized by the outside world. Each conversation, each glance, each overlooked warning added pressure, bringing the relationship closer to a breaking point that, by that day in June, would no longer remain avoidable. The tipping point arrived subtly. A seemingly minor disagreement escalated internally, shaped by unresolved resentment, lingering attachment, and obsessive attention. In that moment, choices were made whose consequences could not be undone. The tension that had long simmered, jealousy, fear, and conflicting desires, reached an intensity that set the stage for the inevitable. Every hesitation, glance, and word carried a weight previously invisible to those around them. That day, in the quiet space of a home that had once been a sanctuary, the ordinary gestures of life became entangled with irreversible decisions, quietly sealing the path toward tragedy. Later that day, Travis Alexander's life came to a violent end. Public reports and forensic evidence confirmed Jodi Arias' presence at the scene, and her multiple accounts conflicted with physical findings. While details of the violence were documented, they are muted here. The focus lies not in gore but in the psychological and moral rupture of ordinary life. The act shattered family, friends, and community alike, setting in motion a legal battle and a public fascination with questions of motive, accountability, and human fragility. Shock and disbelief rippled through family and friends. Law enforcement confronted a maze of contradictory statements, digital evidence, and emerging forensic details. Media attention intensified the emotional toll, amplifying every nuance and uncertainty. Close acquaintances struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the reality of his death. Investigators worked meticulously, piecing together a timeline and clarifying conflicting accounts. The aftermath was a slow unraveling of truth, revealing how ordinary relationships can conceal profound instability and the devastating consequences when hidden tensions reach their breaking point. The trial highlighted systemic challenges, Arias' shifting narratives, attempts at manipulation, and claims of abuse complicated investigative and legal efforts. Questions arose about the recognition of warning signs, interpretation of psychological assessments, and societal biases affecting perception. Media scrutiny added pressure, creating a courtroom environment where evidence and emotion intersected intensely. Legal delays, Conflicting expert testimony and public polarization revealed vulnerabilities in both the justice system and societal understanding of complex human behavior. The case underscored how institutional structures can falter when confronted with emotionally charged, high-profile crimes. The tragedy forces reflection on obsession, secrecy, and human fragility. Could intervention have prevented the outcome? How do psychological tension and unchecked emotion shape irreversible choices? The lives affected, the young man lost, the family forever changed, the public simultaneously fascinated and horrified, illustrate that ordinary days can mask extraordinary darkness. The story lingers not as closure but as a warning, inviting viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about morality, judgment, and the consequences of choices made in shadowed moments. Stop right there. If Jodi Arias just left you speechless, brace yourself, because that was number 1, and we've got 9 more cases that'll haunt you even worse. But here's the thing. If you're watching this without being subscribed, you're playing a dangerous game. You'll finish this video, YouTube will recommend some random nonsense, and you'll never find your way back to stories this gripping. Don't let that happen. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not later, not maybe. Right now, because I promise you, case number 2 will make you glad you did. Are you in? Then let's keep going. Number 2 is Marissa Suzanne DeVault. January 14, 2009, Gilbert, Arizona. The house is quiet in the way suburban homes often are late at night. No shouting. No neighbors at the door. Inside a bedroom, Dale Harrell is asleep. The moment is ordinary enough to disappear into memory, except it doesn't. Somewhere in that stillness, a decision is made. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. What follows will take weeks to fully unfold, and years to be judged. But the violence begins here, in silence, while one person sleeps and another stands awake, holding something heavy. To the outside world, Dale Harrell was 34 years old, a husband, a man living a largely unremarkable life in Gilbert, a Phoenix suburb built on predictability. Friends and neighbors saw a couple navigating the usual stresses. Money, relationships, blended family tensions. Nothing that screamed emergency. Marissa DeVault, his wife, moved through that same space as a mother, a partner, someone trying to appear functional. The home didn't look dangerous. It looked lived in, normal. And normalcy has a way of dulling suspicion, even when something underneath it is quietly rotting. Inside the marriage, the story fractures. Marissa later describes years of abuse, physical, sexual, much of it unseen by those around them. Her daughter would testify that the household felt tumultuous, that arguments and infidelity cut through daily life. Prosecutors would paint a different pressure building at the same time. Debt. Large, consuming debt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars borrowed from a boyfriend, Alan Flores. A relationship hidden behind lies about inheritance and identity. Money, secrecy, resentment, fear. None of it visible from the sidewalk. Just a private storm, sealed behind walls. There were warnings that never quite formed into alarms. Testimony later suggested Marissa spoke about wanting Dale dead, about insurance money, about ways out that involved someone else doing the violence for her. Other accounts questioned her credibility, noting stories that shifted, explanations that bent under scrutiny. Abuse claims existed, but corroboration was uneven. Psychologists would later disagree sharply about who Marissa was beneath the surface. What's clear is that by that January night, whatever balance once existed was gone. The marriage had crossed into a place where ordinary solutions no longer seemed possible to her. The point of no return doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as resolve. Dale was asleep in their bedroom when Marissa attacked him with a hammer. There was no argument heard, no struggle witnessed. Prosecutors said the blows came repeatedly, delivered while he lay defenseless. Marissa would offer different versions, first blaming another man in the house, then describing a rage after an alleged assault. The physical evidence told its own story. Blood spatter patterns suggested the attack happened while Dale was in bed, alone. Dale didn't die that night. He survived the initial beating, suffering multiple skull fractures. For weeks, he lived with catastrophic injuries, enduring complications, strokes, heart attacks, until he died nearly a month later in hospice from a pulmonary embolism linked to the trauma. Death arrived slowly, stretching the violence forward in time. Not a single moment, but a lingering consequence. In the immediate aftermath, confusion dominated. Police encountered Marissa in distress, describing an attack, claiming she had been choked into unconsciousness. Medical staff noted slight redness on her neck but no significant injuries. Investigators began finding contradictions. A false confession letter surfaced, signed by a brain-damaged friend who lived in the home. Attention shifted to insurance policies, to money owed, to phone calls and messages that suggested planning rather than panic. The story refused to settle into something simple. The courtroom became the next battleground. Prosecutors argued premeditation, pointing to debts, insurance, and testimony from Flores, whose own credibility was compromised by immunity deals tied to child pornography found on his computer. The defense leaned on abuse, on fear, on self-defense. Psychologists clashed, one diagnosing Marissa as a psychopath with antisocial traits and a lack of remorse, citing jailhouse calls where she laughed about the killing. Another supporting her claims of lifelong abuse. The system strained under contradiction, asking a jury to decide not just what happened, but who to believe when every narrative felt contaminated. On April 8, 2014, Marissa DeVault was convicted of first-degree murder. Weeks later, the jury spared her the death penalty, sentencing her to life in prison, with the possibility of release after 25 years. In court, she cried, apologized, spoke of her children and the shadow her actions would cast over them. Outside, some felt justice was done. Others felt something unresolved, uneasy. This case doesn't end cleanly. It leaves questions that refuse to stay inside the courtroom. How much weight should unproven abuse carry when evidence points elsewhere? What happens when a key witness is morally compromised, yet legally protected? And how often does financial desperation reshape someone's idea of escape into something irreversible? Dale Harrell lost his life in pieces. First his safety, then his future, then his breath. Marissa DeVault will spend decades with a sentence that acknowledges guilt without fully explaining motive. And somewhere between those two truths sits the uncomfortable space the story occupies. A reminder that violence often grows quietly, behind closed doors, until one ordinary night becomes impossible to forget. Number 3 is Shauna Ford. May 30, 2009, Arivica, Arizona. The desert town is asleep, the kind of place where midnight feels empty rather than dangerous. Inside a small home, a 9-year-old girl has already fallen asleep on the couch, her puppy close enough to breathe warmth into the quiet. Her parents think the night is over. When there's a knock at the door, it doesn't sound urgent, just official, calm, the kind of interruption people trust. Outside, someone is pretending to be law enforcement. Inside, a family is about to learn how easily authority can be faked and how quickly certainty collapses. Raul Jr. Flores was 29, a husband, a father, a man raising his children in a remote border community. Arivica wasn't polished or wealthy, but it was familiar. Neighbors knew each other. Families looked out for their own. Brazenia, his daughter, was 9, old enough to ask questions, young enough to believe answers. To the outside world, this was a household like many others along the border. Complicated, imperfect, but alive with routine. No one looking in from the road would have seen a target. Just a family settling into the night. Elsewhere, far from that living room, Shauna Ford was chasing a different version of purpose. She had built an identity around vigilance, around the idea that violence could be justified if it wore the costume of patriotism. After being pushed out of other border groups for instability, she founded her own Minutemen American Defense. The language was grand. The reality was smaller and darker. Money was scarce. Influence was slipping. According to prosecutors, the mission quietly shifted from watching the border to stealing from people believed to be criminals. In that shift, ideology stopped being abstract. It became personal, operational, and dangerous. Ford believed Raul Flores was a drug trafficker. Others around her reinforced that belief. Whether it was true in the way she imagined remains disputed, but the conclusion had already been drawn. Plans were discussed. Roles were assigned. The idea hardened into action. A home invasion, disguised as law enforcement, meant to take money and drugs to fund a vigilante group that claimed to protect the country. What's striking is how ordinary that decision must have felt to those involved. Another step, another operation, another rationalization. By the time they drove toward the Flores home, the moral debate was already over. The door opened after midnight. Ford stood there with two men, Jason "Gunny" Bush and Albert Gaxiola, claiming they were looking for fugitives. Inside, Raul questioned them. Seconds later, the fiction fell apart. Gunfire erupted. Raul was shot. Gina Gonzalez, his wife, was hit in the leg. Brasinia woke to terror, crying, pleading. The attackers left briefly, then returned. While Gina was on the phone with 911, gunshots echoed again. Brasinia was killed. Raul was dead. The night fractured into screams, smoke, and disbelief that would never fully settle back into silence. When the attackers finally fled, Gina survived by playing dead, then fighting back with a handgun left in the house. Her 911 call captured fear in real time. Confusion, desperation, the raw sound of loss forming as it happened. Investigators would later recover dropped weapons, trace movements, and follow threads that led back to Ford and her group. Jewelry from the home was found in Ford's possession. Text messages tied planning to execution. What initially looked like chaos began to reveal structure. The trial exposed uncomfortable tensions. Prosecutors described Ford as the architect, the one who ordered the raid. The defense argued she wasn't even there, that there was no DNA or fingerprints placing her inside the house. Supporters claimed she was being targeted for her politics, that the investigation was flawed. But the jury heard about recruitment efforts, about plans to rob suspected drug dealers, about how ideology slid into entitlement. They listened to a mother describe hearing her child beg for her life. 8 guilty verdicts followed. On February 22, 2011, Shauna Ford was sentenced to death. She became the third woman on Arizona's death row. Jason Bush would also receive the death penalty. Albert Gaxiola was sentenced to life without parole plus decades more. The legal outcome was decisive, but it didn't simplify the damage. 2 lives were gone. A family was shattered. A community was forced to confront what happens when fear is organized and given permission to act. This case leaves a question that refuses to stay contained. At what point does rhetoric become a weapon? When does a belief system cross from speech into blood? The Flores family were American citizens, killed by people who claimed to be defending America. That contradiction sits heavy, unresolved. And it lingers beyond this house, beyond this desert town, into the next story, where justification will again be used as cover, and where the cost will once more be paid by people who never agreed to be part of the fight. 3 cases down, and the darkness only deepens. If you're still watching without hitting that like button, now's the moment. That simple thumbs up tells me you want more content like this. And believe me, the cases ahead are even more disturbing. Show some love and smash that like button. Number 4 is Galerica Harrison. On September 5, 2007, Tucson, Arizona, a university dormitory is supposed to feel temporary. A place where nothing permanent happens. A place where conflicts are handled by paperwork, not blood. Inside Graham Greenlee Residence Hall, 2 18-year-old freshmen are sharing a room they didn't choose and attention no one outside seems to notice. One of them is already awake. The other believes the worst part of the situation is over. By the time the hallway fills with screaming, the idea that this was ever just a roommate dispute becomes impossible to defend. Mia Janelle Henderson arrived at the University of Arizona carrying the weight of expectation and the ease of someone used to meeting it. She was disciplined, focused, admired. Friends saw her as dependable, steady, quietly ambitious. Back home, she was known as Princess Mia, a student athlete with plans that reached far beyond campus. Galerica Harrison arrived with a similar story: scholarship, talent, promise. She was soft-spoken, polite, not someone who drew concern. To the university, pairing them together made sense. Two young Navajo women, both high achievers, both far from home, both expected to succeed. What didn't make sense and wasn't taken seriously was how quickly that shared space turned hostile. Henderson realized her dorm access card was missing, then her social security card, then money from her account. The theft wasn't abstract. It was personal and invasive. When Henderson confronted it, Harrison admitted stealing. Identity theft and forgery followed. Henderson reported it to campus police and demanded action. She asked to be separated. She asked for protection. Instead, she was told to calm down, to let it go, to shake hands and move on. The institution treated it like a misunderstanding, not a threat. The room stayed the same. The tension stayed sealed inside. Harrison left campus for Labor Day weekend with the consequences pressing in. Charges were possible. Expulsion was real. The identity she had built, student, athlete, future professional, was beginning to collapse. Friends later described her as unsettled, carrying a vague sense that something bad was coming. On the drive back to Tucson, she stopped at a store and bought a large kitchen knife. The explanation was ordinary enough not to raise alarm. Ordinary explanations often are. Back in the dorm, Henderson had made a decision of her own. She told friends she was pressing charges and didn't want to live with Harrison anymore. An apology message came from Harrison later. Henderson didn't respond. The distance between them was no longer emotional. It was procedural, legal, irreversible. That distance seemed to tighten something rather than relieve it. Before dawn, prosecutors say Harrison wrote a note pretending to be Henderson. A message implying despair, regret, self-blame. It was an attempt to reshape the story before violence ever occurred. When the attack came, it wasn't loud at first. Henderson was stabbed repeatedly, 23 times. Many wounds to her back. She tried to defend herself. Down the hall, students woke to screaming and the sound of violent movement, unsure where it was coming from, unsure how to react. By the time help reached the room, Henderson was dying. The aftermath was chaotic and confused. Harrison was found injured, crying, telling a story about an unknown attacker. Hours of police interviews followed. Laughter, sobbing, denial, shifting explanations. Evidence contradicted her account. Medical testimony revealed the extent of the wounds and the force involved. The narrative of panic collapsed under the weight of preparation and consistency. A jury would later call the evidence overwhelming. What lingers uncomfortably is what came before. Henderson reported theft. She asked for help. She insisted on separation. Each step was minimized. A crime that should have triggered immediate removal didn't. Authority figures laughed. Delays piled up. The system didn't cause the violence, but it failed to interrupt it. That failure sits between every fact in this case. In November 2008, Galerica Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge spoke about choices made early, choices repeated, choices that couldn't be undone. Harrison asked for forgiveness in words few could hear. Henderson's family left with a future that had been cut off at 18. Two promising lives became a permanent absence for an entire community. This case doesn't end with closure. It ends with a question that refuses to stay inside the dorm room. When institutions downplay warning signs, who carries the cost? And how many other conflicts are being waved away right now, in places that feel safe, waiting for the moment when it's already too late? Number 5 is Carol Hatley. July 30th, 2012, Phoenix, Arizona. The house was still dark when Carol Hatley walked next door. Not frantic, not screaming, just unsteady, the kind of sway that comes from alcohol, not panic. She told her neighbor her mother was dead and asked her to call for help. Hours had already passed. Inside the home, plastic bags lay waiting. Whatever had happened that night didn't begin with chaos. It unfolded slowly, in silence, behind closed doors, long before anyone else knew something had gone wrong. To the outside world, Deborah Hatley was an elderly mother living quietly in the home she'd owned since the early 1970s. 73 years old. A woman described by family as warm, humorous, devoted to her children. Carol, her 42-year-old daughter, had moved back in less than a year earlier. From the street, nothing about the arrangement seemed unusual. Adult children return home all the time. Neighbors saw nothing dramatic, just a mother and daughter sharing space, routine, and history, the kind of domestic normalcy people trust without questioning. But shared homes don't erase old fractures. Family members later described a relationship strained by years of tension. Arguments that didn't always turn physical, but never fully healed either. Alcohol was part of Carol's daily life, not as a backdrop but as a catalyst. When she drank, relatives said she could become volatile. Whatever balance existed in that house depended on restraint, on avoidance, on things left unsaid. And slowly that balance eroded. Routine didn't bring comfort anymore. It became a pressure cooker that on the night Deborah Hatley died, the story Carol would tell kept changing. She claimed she found her mother's body around 7 in the evening. But she didn't call for help. She didn't knock on doors. For more than 7 hours, she stayed inside the house with her mother's body. Later, she would admit to tampering with evidence. She would describe her mother's injuries in detail, too much detail for someone who claimed confusion. When police finally arrived, they described Carol as passive, emotionless, intoxicated. There was no urgency in her voice, no visible grief in her posture. There is always a moment where silence becomes a decision, a point where inaction turns into intent. Sometime during those hours alone in the house, the line was crossed. Deborah Hatley had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds were fatal, and after her death, the violence didn't stop. Police would later say she was in the process of being dismembered when officers arrived. Plastic bags were found nearby, large, deliberate, unmistakable. Carol told investigators she was wrapping her mother to take her to the hospital. It was a claim that didn't fit the scene or the timeline. The crime itself wasn't loud. No forced entry. No struggle that spilled into the street. Just a kitchen knife, a closed house, and two people who had lived together long enough to know each other's vulnerabilities. Deborah Hatley died inside her own home, at the hands of her daughter. By the time authorities arrived in the early hours of the morning, the damage, physical and moral, had already been done. The aftermath was marked by confusion and contradiction. Carol's statements shifted. The neighbor who called 911 told police Carol mentioned the death hours earlier than she claimed. Investigators noted her lack of visible remorse. Evidence suggested planning or at least preparation after the fact. Family members spoke of alcohol abuse and a volatile temper. And yet, there were no prior police reports between mother and daughter. No official paper trail documenting the tension that ended in murder. The legal system moved quickly but narrowly. Carol Hatley was charged with second-degree murder. She entered a plea agreement. There would be no trial that unpacked every argument. No courtroom confrontation forcing the family to relive decades of conflict. In April 2013, she was sentenced to 22 years in prison. A finite number for an irreversible act. The justice system closed the case, but it never answered the deeper questions. How does a lifelong relationship decay to this point without intervention? How many warning signs are dismissed as family issues before they turn fatal? Carol Hatley didn't confess. She didn't fully explain. And the system didn't demand more than it needed to secure a conviction. Deborah Hatley is remembered as a loving mother. Carol Hatley will spend decades defined by a single night. Between them lies a silence filled with choices, failures, and unanswered responsibility. Questions that don't end with this case, but carry forward into the next. We're halfway through this chilling countdown, and if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because these stories need to be heard, and you deserve to be part of this community. Don't let another case pass you by. Number 6 is Diane Lynn Marsh. March 22, 2007, Pima County, Arizona. The night began quietly, almost indistinguishably from countless others. Brandon Williams, 5 years old and autistic, had already settled into his evening routine, the comfort of familiar rhythms guiding him to sleep. The house held its usual stillness, the kind that feels safe to those on the outside. Yet inside, a shadow had been creeping for months. Small choices, repeated actions, and silences that accumulated into something irreversible. By the time emergency calls were made, Brandon was already unresponsive, a child trapped at the intersection of neglect, control, and fear. To the outside world, Diane Lynn Marsh appeared calm, composed, even gentle. Church members spoke of her patience, her faith, the dedication she supposedly showed toward her son. Friends and neighbors saw a mother engaged in her child's life, asking for help when needed, navigating challenges with quiet determination. Brandon, in their eyes, was loved, even cherished, a child growing in a home that seemed ordinary, if imperfect. That ordinary image would later collide violently with the hidden truths of the household. Inside the walls of that home, care had slowly morphed into control. Brandon had been removed from school months earlier. Counseling sessions stopped. Contact with Child Protective Services was fragmented or non-existent. The routines that had once structured his world were replaced with isolation. Physical discipline became normalized. Court records describe him being tied up, given adult doses of sleep medication, and immersed in hot water as punishment. These weren't single incidents, they unfolded over 6 months, each reinforcing a quiet terror that no outsider could detect. Marsh did not live alone. Flower Thompson and Thompson's companion, Mark Lee Moss, occupied the house as well, fracturing what little stability remained. Marsh would later claim she believed Thompson had power over her, that threats of satanic groups justified preemptive violence toward Brandon. The court rejected that explanation. What was undeniable was her withdrawal from anyone who might have intervened. Family, school officials, CPS. Even when concerns were raised, the system failed to act with urgency, leaving a child increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Neglect had crossed an invisible line. On that night, when emergency responders arrived close to midnight, Brandon was in cardiac arrest. Medics attempted resuscitation, rushing him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Initial reports suggested medication complications. The autopsy revealed something far grimmer: blunt force trauma. His skull was fractured, his brain hemorrhaging. Old wounds, healing marks, evidence of restraint. All told a story of ongoing abuse, a life constrained by fear and violence that no one outside the home could perceive. The crime didn't erupt from sudden rage or strangers. It unfolded in the place where Brandon should have been safest. Prosecutors argued that either Marsh, Thompson, or both had forced his head against a hard surface. No one admitted to delivering the fatal blow. Both women blamed each other. The truth remained locked inside that house, with a child who could no longer speak. Afterward, contradictions abounded. Marsh cried in court, spoke of remorse, yet recorded jail calls reflected no grief for Brandon. Only conversations about religion, demons, and herself. Investigators noted shifting explanations and partial acceptance of responsibility. Brandon's father, Melvin Williams, voiced the question that haunted the case. Why didn't anyone return his son to safety? The system had already failed Brandon repeatedly. Child Protective Services had prior involvement, but intervention was insufficient. A deputy had seen him a week prior, noticed bandaged feet, and left him in the home. Reports were delayed, arriving too late to prevent the tragedy. At trial, Marsh was convicted of negligent homicide and child abuse, not murder. The jury chose a lesser charge. She was sentenced to 10 years, a finite measure for a life of quiet suffering and a death steeped in preventable neglect. At sentencing, the judge remarked on Brandon's bewilderment, noting that the person he trusted most had allowed harm to reach him. "His blood is on your hands," the court declared, yet the legal consequences were limited. The questions remained open, lingering. Who failed Brandon first? The mother who controlled him, the adults who remained silent, the system that repeatedly missed warning signs, or the community that accepted appearances over scrutiny. Brandon loved routine, school, and small moments of connection. His life, cut short in silence, forces reflection. How many children exist now in similar quiet suffering, waiting for someone to see beyond the surface, to act before it's too late? The answers remain unresolved, haunting, and impossible to ignore. Number 7 is Marjorie and Orbin. September 8, 2004, Phoenix, Arizona. The sun had just dipped behind suburban rooftops, leaving long shadows stretching across quiet streets. Jay Orbin returned home from a lengthy road trip, suitcase in hand, expecting the familiar rhythm of family life. Inside, Marjorie greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The soft hum of the television, the faint clink of keys on the counter, a child's laughter echoing down the hall, all ordinary. And yet, beneath those mundane signals, tension hung in the air, subtle and almost imperceptible, like a storm gathering behind closed curtains. Something was off, though no one outside could guess how quickly the ordinary would become unimaginable. To friends and neighbors, the Orbins were the picture of stability. Jay, 45, a respected jewelry dealer, carried charm and steadiness in every interaction. Marjorie, 47, a former Las Vegas showgirl turned devoted wife and mother, appeared attentive, composed, and grounded. Their son, Noah, was cherished, the center of their lives. Church members described Marjorie as gracious, patient, deeply caring. Their home seemed warm, ordinary, unremarkable. On the surface, nothing suggested the undercurrents threatening to shatter that life. The neighborhood trusted the Orbins, unaware of the private tensions quietly twisting inside. Behind closed doors, the story was far more complicated. Marjorie's life was a web of secrecy and desire. Extramarital affairs, financial ambitions, and a craving for control quietly entangled her daily existence. Fertility struggles, jealousy, and simmering resentment gnawed at the marriage. Late-night calls, unexplained purchases, lingering glances, all small cracks forming in the polished veneer. Jay remained largely unaware, trusting, attentive, blinded by love for family. Each interaction carried the faintest undertone of unease, subtle enough to be overlooked, yet potent enough to foreshadow the irreversible moment soon to arrive. That moment crystallized quietly. Decisions, hesitations, and concealed truths converged into a turning point where ordinary life could no longer persist. Marjorie's intentions, shaped by greed, desire, and perhaps fear, shifted from private schemes to irreversible action. By evening, the boundary between secrecy and violence dissolved. Jay Orbin was killed. The act was precise, calculated, and chilling in its emotional restraint. His body was dismembered and hidden, an attempt to erase both the crime and the evidence of betrayal. Rooms once filled with laughter now echoed emptiness, leaving only questions and dread in the wake of absence. The immediate aftermath was disorienting. Friends and family, desperate for answers, faced Marjorie's calm explanations amid the growing concern of a missing husband. Investigators uncovered surveillance footage, receipts, and other traces of meticulous planning. Weeks later, a plastic container confirmed suspicions. Jay's torso, a grim testament to the violence hidden behind domestic walls. Each revelation layered shock upon grief, while Marjorie's composure, precise and controlled, deepened suspicion and disbelief. Systemic failures soon became evident. Investigators navigated partial evidence, conflicting witness accounts, and procedural delays. Alternative suspects were proposed. Marjorie's statements and denials complicated matters, raising ethical and legal questions about manipulation and intent. The law moved slowly against a backdrop of calculated deception, highlighting both the fragility of legal processes and the weight of human betrayal. Moral and procedural tension intertwined as the case unfolded, forcing observers to question how justice can contend with deliberate concealment. Eventually, Marjorie was convicted. Legal closure came, But the void of Jay's absence remained irreparable. His family, especially Noah, confronted grief without answers. Memories of ordinary routines now laced with suspicion and horror. Reflections on morality, trust, and domestic danger lingered, emphasizing that even familiar faces may hide intentions capable of catastrophic violence. The story leaves a haunting question. How many homes shelter secrets that, if left unchecked, could erupt into tragedy? How many seemingly ordinary lives carry the weight of deception, resentment, and suppressed danger, waiting for one decisive act to collapse? Jay Orbin's death is a reminder that darkness often emerges quietly, behind the doors we trust most, leaving a moral reckoning that extends far beyond the courtroom. 7 cases down, 3 to go, and trust me, it only gets more twisted from here. Quick check. Have you liked this video yet? If not, do it right now. Your support keeps this channel alive and brings you more deep dives into true crime's darkest corners. Hit that like button before we continue. Number 8 is Valerie Pape. January 23, 2000, Mesa, Arizona. The morning began like any other, quiet in a Scottsdale home where sunlight traced patterns across the kitchen floor. Valerie Pape, 47, moved through the familiar rhythm of her daily routine, unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to acknowledge the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Her husband, Ira Pomerantz, 60, was a presence both ordinary and imposing, a bar owner whose routines collided with hers in ways that had grown quietly contentious over the years. A domestic rhythm existed, yet within it, contradictions festered. Loyalty and resentment, love and fear, routine and instability. Something ordinary was about to unravel into the unthinkable. To the outside world, Valerie was calm, composed, a Scottsdale hairdresser known to clients and friends as gentle and trustworthy. She had friendships with local figures, including State Senator Russell Bowers, who remembered her warmth and kindness. Ira, 60, seemed a stable figure, though not without friction in his marriage. Their home appeared typical, their lives ordinary. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends would later insist that nothing hinted at the violence lurking behind closed doors. Valerie's reputation, carefully maintained, contrasted sharply with the dark decisions quietly taking shape. Beneath that calm exterior, strain and secrecy had taken root. The marriage was reportedly stormy. Financial disputes, personal resentments, and emotional instability had quietly accumulated. Valerie moved with caution, her interactions measured, concealing fears and frustrations. The private conflicts of the household remained invisible to outsiders. Late arguments, subtle threats, unresolved disputes, and the quiet erosion of trust. Routine masked tension. Ordinary gestures became laden with unspoken meaning. In the shadows of the home, decisions were forming. Decisions that would end a life and transform ordinary domesticity into horror. The point of no return arrived in a brief, decisive moment. An argument escalated, or perhaps reached its final, unavoidable culmination. Valerie Pape shot Ira Pomerantz, her husband, during a domestic dispute. In that instant, the boundary between private conflict and irrevocable violence dissolved. No one else was present, no witnesses could intervene, and the act, while sudden, carried the weight of long-simmering discord. The home, once a place of routine and predictability, became the site of finality, a rupture with consequences that could not be undone. In the hours that followed, Valerie concealed her actions. The body was left in the home, clothed, face up, a silent testament to the event that had occurred. Days later, she disposed of the headless, armless, and legless torso in a trash container behind a Mesa grocery store. Surveillance and witness reports would later trace the disposal back to her, though she never disclosed the details of dismemberment or the remaining body parts. The physical act of violence was compounded by calculation and concealment, leaving investigators to piece together a story from fragments, traces, and confessions. The aftermath rippled outward. Friends, colleagues, and the victim's family struggled with disbelief. Valerie's explanations were calm, measured, and incomplete, leaving gaps in understanding. Investigators uncovered receipts, such as one for a reciprocating saw, a potential tool for dismemberment, and identified a gun used in the shooting. Media coverage highlighted the grisly discovery and the domestic context of the murder, while public reaction oscillated between shock, disbelief, and attempts to reconcile Valerie's prior persona with her actions. Systemic and ethical complications soon surfaced. The plea deal in 2002 reduced the charge to second-degree murder, resulting in a 16-year sentence with no parole. Questions persisted about legal strategy, the protection of victims' rights, and the handling of evidence. Later, international transfer discussions to France sparked controversy, with authorities reconsidering release in light of victims' family concerns. Procedural decisions, combined with incomplete information regarding the location of the remaining body, underscored the limitations of justice in the face of deliberate concealment and complex human motives. The moral reckoning remains unresolved. Valerie Pape served time for her crime, yet the absence of closure, the dismembered remains, and the silence surrounding their whereabouts leave lingering questions. How do we measure accountability when concealment obscures truth? How do we understand domestic violence that escalates beyond recognition, where ordinary life hides extraordinary danger? Ira Pomerantz's death challenges observers to confront the fragile boundaries between love, resentment, secrecy, and violence, leaving a reflection that stretches far beyond the courtroom. Even years later, the case evokes tension between perception and reality, between reputation and truth. Valerie's outward persona, friendly and warm, could not shield her actions from consequence. Yet the fragments of life, the memories of Ira Pomerantz, and the unresolved moral dilemmas remain. The story lingers not in resolution, but in the questions it forces us to face. How often do domestic routines mask danger, and what hidden tensions may quietly await their own inevitable moment of collapse? Number 9 is Jessica Renee Riggins. August 5, 2007, Jessica Riggins drove to a sporting goods store in Flagstaff and bought a .22 caliber handgun. She tried the day before but didn't have a local address. So she went to the DMV, got an ID with her husband's address, came back. The clerk processed the sale. Jessica held the gun, felt its weight. Rusty was at home in Boulder Point. They had divorce proceedings in 2 days. She'd left her children with relatives. Everything she did looked like preparation, but she would claim it was coincidence, self-defense, and accident. To people who knew them, Rusty and Jessica Riggins had a troubled marriage moving toward resolution. Rusty had been convicted twice of domestic violence against Jessica. By 2007, he'd started a moving business. His mother said the drugs and alcohol were behind him. Jessica had moved to Lake Tahoe in 2006. She had 5 children. The couple was scheduled to finalize their divorce. From the outside, it looked like 2 people finally going separate ways. What people didn't see was Jessica driving back to Flagstaff alone, buying a gun, telling relatives Rusty had $30,000 she wanted. The prosecution painted what drove Jessica. She'd spent days trying to get Rusty arrested, hoping his probation would be revoked. She contacted police, probation, media, claiming violations, suicide risk, drug use. None worked. Half a dozen witnesses testified about $30,000 she believed he had. She had power of attorney. If Rusty were jailed during divorce proceedings, she believed she'd get that money. But Rusty wasn't cooperating, so she bought a gun. The defense told a different story about a woman who'd endured abuse. Jessica testified Rusty had punched her, choked her, thrown a knife, burned her hand, smashed car windows. She said she loved him and kept believing he'd change. She married him in 2004 despite everything. The night she shot him, she claimed she'd come hoping to reconcile. She said she was defending herself, that the gun went off accidentally. But she'd left her children behind, bought a gun days earlier. Rusty was shot in the back. His body was found August 7th in the master bedroom. He'd been shot at close range. The bullet pierced both lungs and his heart. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of a fight. The room was quiet, undisturbed. Jessica had taken the car belonging to Rusty's mother and disappeared. Her own Jeep was found abandoned less than a mile away. Jessica drove to California and visited her ex-husband, his sister, and her son. She told the sister she needed to burn her clothes, cut and dye her hair, turn over custody of her children. She said, "I did it. I killed him." When encouraged to turn herself in, Jessica said she was going to wait until the media played up the domestic violence. Then she crossed into Mexico. A week later, trying to re-enter the country, she was arrested. The trial revealed how domestic violence complicates guilt. Jessica's attorneys argued she suffered from battered woman syndrome. Rusty had 2 felony convictions for violence against her. But friends said Jessica was equally aggressive. The jury heard about beatings Jessica endured and about her spending days trying to ruin Rusty's life, her claims about money, her efforts to get him arrested. When she testified, some jurors later said she wasn't credible. On February 24, 2009, the jury convicted Jessica of first-degree murder, auto theft, and credit card theft. 2 jurors were crying. Judge Hendricks sentenced her to life with possibility of parole in 25 years. The judge said Jessica deserved leniency because she'd been a victim of domestic violence, had a traumatic childhood, loved her children, but she'd used a weapon, committed the crime for money, fled the country. Rusty's mother Judith forgave Jessica but asked for life without parole. You're left wondering if abuse justifies murder, if victimhood erases premeditation, if buying a gun 2 days before shooting someone in the back can be called self-defense. Jessica will be 66 before she's eligible for parole. But maybe the hardest part is knowing we'll never fully understand what happened in that bedroom. Whether Jessica was a battered woman who snapped or a manipulative killer who wrapped murder in the language of survival. Rusty Riggins was shot in the back and never got to tell his side. Just one case left, but before we get there, if you're still here without subscribing, seriously, what's holding you back? Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and join thousands of true crime fans who never miss a story this gripping. The final case is waiting, and it's one you absolutely cannot miss. Number 10 is Angela M. Simpson. August 5, 2009, the summer air in North Phoenix was heavy, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and desert dust. Inside a modest apartment on the 9600 block of North 12th Avenue, Angela Simpson moved with a calm, measured precision. On the surface, she seemed absorbed in the mundane rhythms of her life, yet there was an edge to her gestures, a quiet intensity that hinted at something darker. A mirror reflected the room's small chaos, but also, unexpectedly, the looming presence of fear, control, and premeditation. The ordinary was about to fracture, and no one outside would fully grasp how far. To the neighbors and casual acquaintances, Angela Simpson appeared capable and composed. She navigated her days with a familiar rhythm, blending into the urban landscape. Friends described her as articulate, someone who could command attention when she wished, yet she remained an enigma to most. Her private life, known only to a few, was layered with relationships, responsibilities, and personal struggles that painted a picture of a woman who was complex and, at times, contradictory. Beneath her exterior, the tensions of her world were quietly gathering momentum, unnoticed and unchallenged by those around her. Behind closed doors, Angela's life was anything but ordinary. She had constructed a narrative of control, targeting Terry Neely, a man confined to a motorized wheelchair, whom she accused of being a snitch. In her mind, justice demanded extreme measures. Her planning was meticulous. A lure, a promise of sex and drugs, a calculated path to exert dominance. Over 3 days, she enacted a series of calculated acts of torture, each a precise expression of rage, fear, and moral justification. The intensity of her actions masked the fragile emotional threads that often collapse before violence, threads that she seemed determined to sever entirely. By August 5th, the decision was irreversible. Angela had orchestrated a scenario that would trap Neely, leaving him helpless and exposed. Each choice, from the coaxing words to the placement of the mirror, carried an ethical weight impossible to undo. The moment was heavy, pregnant with consequence, as if the very air in the apartment recognized the point of no return. Subtle cues, a tightened grip on a tire iron, a glance at a mirror reflecting her own reflection, spoke volumes of premeditation and moral rupture, yet she remained unerringly composed, almost clinical in her actions. The act itself was brief in execution but devastating in impact. Angela Simpson strangled Neely with a television cable, struck him repeatedly with a tire iron, and drove a 3-inch nail into his skull. She stabbed him dozens of times, removed his teeth, and dismembered his body. The horror was compounded by her insistence that Neely witness it all in a mirror, a surreal and controlled theater of violence. When she had finished, she placed the remains in a trash can, ignited it, and left the scene, an unsettling calm in her demeanor contrasting with the chaos she had wrought. The discovery came hours later. Firefighters responding to a burning trash can behind a Phoenix church found Neely's charred and dismembered body. Investigators were confronted with a scene that defied comprehension. A wheelchair-bound man subjected to unimaginable brutality. The initial shock rippled through family, neighbors, and the wider community. Conflicting reports and scarce clues heightened uncertainty. It took nearly 2 weeks to trace the crime back to Angela Simpson, whose calm admission in jailhouse interviews only deepened the sense of moral disquiet. Systemic fractures became evident in the unfolding investigation. While Phoenix police meticulously reconstructed the events, Angela's pre-existing incarceration for unrelated offenses meant her mobility and choices were already constrained within a legal framework. Yet the gruesome nature of her crime, her calculated planning, and her eventual flight between locations highlighted gaps in both oversight and understanding of extreme violent behavior. The case exposed ethical and procedural tensions that left the public questioning how such premeditated brutality could occur unnoticed. The moral questions lingered, unsettled and unresolved. Angela Simpson expressed no remorse. She rationalized her actions, framed Neely as deserving, and even suggested she might act again if circumstances permitted. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred in the minds of some, yet the reality of Neely's suffering remained undeniable. Beyond the courtroom, the ethical dissonance of her calm justification haunted observers. How does one reconcile a world where such meticulous cruelty can coexist with the ordinariness of daily life? The shadows of this case stretched beyond the burned trash can, challenging assumptions about human behavior, justice, and the limits of moral reasoning. And there you have it, 10 women, 10 unthinkable crimes, all from the Arizona desert. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the masks people wear, and about the fragility of the ordinary lives we trust so deeply. If this video left you thinking, questioning, maybe even disturbed, good. That means you're paying attention. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me which case shocked you the most. There's more darkness to uncover, more stories that demand to be told, and I'll be right here bringing them to you. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters hide behind the most ordinary faces.